Welcome to Des Talks, our podcast exploring creativity across Scotland. I'm Susanna Beaumont, and I look forward to sharing with you inspiring conversations with some of our most adventurous, curious and brilliant designers, artists, makers and curators. We talk ideas and inspiration, challenges and influences, the contemporary and the historic. Today I'm joined by artists Tania Kovats and Siobhan McLaughlin. We talk mapping, land, extraction, sculpting and all things earthy and watery. Siobhan is currently showing an extraction at Jupiter Artland just to the west of Edinburgh, and Tania is showing in Earth Matters, an exhibition celebrating the life and times of the geologist and farmer James Hutton at Inverleith House, Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh. We do hope you enjoy this conversation, and we would be delighted if you could share, follow, subscribe, rant and rave about Des Talks. Many thanks. I'm delighted today to be joined by Tania Kovats and Siobhan McLaughlin. Tania is speaking from Devon and Siobhan is joining us from Glasgow. I brought these two artists together today because there's an exhibition, Extraction at Jupiter Artland, which is currently on, that Siobhan is in, a group show. And Tania Kovats is in a group show at Inverleith House at the Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh, which I curated, and Tania's showing her work there. But these two artists, and this is what we're going to explore in this conversation, is their curiosity about land, water, and how you can map, record, tell stories, tell narratives, but that sense of curiosity about both the built and so-called natural landscape. So that's the sort of territory we're going to be exploring today. But I would like to start with Tania, and I have known Tania and her practice for a number of years. But I just want to kind of go back to the work that you did for Jupiter, because you've done a permanent artwork at Jupiter, which you did in 2010 called Rivers. And it's a beautiful boathouse within the landscape of Jupiter. And can you just tell me a little bit about that? And obviously it's very near where Siobhan is showing her work. So can you just, how the story of rivers and then, of course, water?
I live by a small river in Devon. I live in an old mill, and I've never lived rurally before, but something about living that close to water made me realise that little line of connection, that stream, was just as kind of vital and real as all the other lines of connection where I live, whether that's the phone or the internet or the road. And the Rivers was one of the first pieces of work I made after having moved to the middle of nowhere in Devon, and just thinking about how we live with water. You know, you don't make a town, a hamlet, a city unless there's a water source nearby. It was an idea to try and kind of bring a whole collection of rivers to one place into a state of confluence. You know, waters that don't come close to each other are brought together in rivers. So I went on a journey around the mainland of the UK, collecting water from 100 rivers, and sort of learned a lot about topography, like, you know, when you're heading for a river, because you're always heading down. And yeah, there were all sorts of things to that journey that just started to make sense about how we live with water. And obviously that's a changing relationship. If you start introducing climate change into that, when rivers don't stay in their banks anymore with flooding, and how that affects so many kind of dwellings in the UK and around the world. I mean, the flooding we see is nothing compared to the flooding certain other bits of the world experience. But yeah, just how we navigate that water life was certainly informed by the work and was a starting point for the work. And then living next to a river, I'm a very literal thinker. So that flow of water to me is very like the flow of time. It's like a literal manifestation of time passing. And I just had some thought that maybe I could capture a moment the way you might take a photograph or make a drawing. But what I wanted to do was make a small amount of moving water still. So in the boathouse, it's a very still experience of water. You look at this collection of water in glass bottles while standing over still water, over a kind of large kind of pond. And there is a sort of water is always in motion normally, and it is always part of this flow of time. But I just wanted to create a kind of still moment within that. I mean, it does relate a little bit to Hutton, because I love the way Hutton talks about time, actually, as a geologist. Sort of, he says somewhere in his writing, there's no such thing as time. Time is a way of describing the duration of an event, which is a really nice way of thinking about time, or not, almost saying it doesn't exist. It's, gets embodied in stone or geology. They're just sort of different speeds of movement. Stone moves a lot slower than water. I think
that's what I kind of find so poignant, having revisited, is both the echoes of current events, as you say, about flooding and then droughts and what we're experiencing in Britain, and let alone, as you say, much more extreme situations around the world. But the stillness, and it is a still life of all this movement. And as you say, outside this boathouse is a list of all the rivers. So, there's the Tweed, there's a Leith, Water of Leith, the Otter that Ouse, the Wye, the Blackadder. And within, maybe just explain once you enter this, you open a door and there's something about this reveal. Maybe just talk through what you see once you walk through, because it is like a still life of all this movement stilled.
So the boathouse is made of wood, and it's standing on stilts that sit into the water of this large pond that's been very beautifully landscaped. And that whole sense of how water is life is very present. The sort of insect life and bird life that are kind of attracted to the water, as well as our, how water draws us as well to be close to it. So you open a wooden door on a latch, and inside, across the water from you, is 100 glass bottles with orange rubber bungs in it. And each bottle is a different river. And outside on the wall of the boathouse is an indexical, alphabetically arranged list of those rivers. And I've been at the boathouse when, a fisherman's turned up and they know most of the rivers. Fishermen are really interesting, kind of quiet environmentalists. And they recognise those words very quickly. And they will be like, oh yeah, I fished in that one, not in that one. And it's kind of interesting how it's not always the way we identify where we are. Like where I don't know, anyone listening now, where's your closest body of water? What river do you live closest to? What sea do you live closest? How do we situate ourselves in relation to water, I think, is another kind of question.
Because in 2014 at the Fruitmarket here in Edinburgh, you showed oceans. So you moved from rivers to oceans, which again, this sense of trying to make intimate the kind of almost the, when we talk about the Indian Ocean or the Pacific, often now, if we do travel, we fly over them. We don't encounter them as we would have done even 100 years ago when we would have sailed or taken boats to most places. So is there a sense of trying to increase our intimacy and our understanding of how our topography and our survival is shaped by water?
Yes, all the seas was big sister work to rivers, where I invited people to send me seawater from all over the world. I wanted to bring all the seas of the world, because they're all named differently and have different kind of geographical boundaries even, which is a strange thing to think about in relation to water. But I wanted to bring them all to one place. So a piece that started about my relationship with the sea and understanding of the world's waters all being connected, then became this collection or library of many people's sea stories, because people would send me water, but they would also send kind of a message of why they'd sent me water from that place, whether it was the sea their father had taught them to swim in, or there were two lads rowing across the Atlantic that filled up a bottle of water halfway. There was a scientist on an expedition in Antarctica that decided to collect water for me in some very difficult to get to sea seas. So, yeah, it was the closest I've got in lots of ways to a sort of participatory work, where my impulse to make this work became about gathering very multi-layered stories about the sea.
But I think what's also vital to your practice is your writing and your publications. And I'm actually sitting here with Drawing Water, which talks about your own practice, but also other artists and designers. I mean, it covers a huge, and we'll go on to Clark Aveld in a little while. But this book, Drawing Water, or the Drawing Book, where you're thinking about drawing as a means of expression. So as much as you often work as a sculptor and you make installations, but the hand and mark making is also vital to the way you explore and kind of measure and make sense of the world that we inhabit.
Mm. And we don't leave the same kind of mark in water. A wake of a boat disappears, our water roads disappear, but they were how we navigated everywhere. And I think a lot about the simplicity of leaving a mark. Sometimes that's all you can do in a day is just make a mark, and that's enough. And drawing is the most kind of contingent and available and direct way of doing that. And the way drawings kind of connect across time and across many different disciplines, their relationship to thinking and understanding, I find really compelling.
I mean, speaking about that and going back to Jupiter, which is this sculptural park and galleries to the west of Edinburgh, very near the airport, and you can look across to the bridges, and it's a place of industry. But also, I remember when we went for the opening of your work, Rivers, that we went by barge. And how slowly, I think it's about 4 miles per hour, but that sense of movement across time and space, and of course on water. But our arrival was slowed down to, it would have been originally how fast a horse could have taken you. But I've always sensed that this, for only in the last 150 years, that, we used to be able to go as quickly as a horse could take us, or a sailboat could sail us, and now obviously we're speeding up with train, plane and automobile. So I suppose that takes me on to Siobhan, who's currently showing in this exhibition Extraction, which is on at Jupiter within the Stedding Gallery space and also in the ballroom. And I suppose we're moving on to terra firma here, because you studied at Edinburgh College of Art and graduated in 2019, but your kind of interest is always being about the ground, the landscape, and of trying to kind of reveal maybe a different history and answering back to perhaps the sense of romanticising the landscape, which is particularly pertinent and poignant within Scotland. So maybe just talk a little bit about your sense of looking and land.
Yeah, for years my work has kind of been an intentional questioning of the romanticisation of particularly Scottish landscapes, and kind of the valuing of these landscapes primarily for their aesthetic value, thinking through history of art of kind of who was commissioning paintings of Scotland in the 1700s, which I think has really for centuries led us to minimise the land's ecological and cultural and social importance. So yeah, I've always been trying to depict Scotland in a way that's not romantic, which is often difficult because it's it's an incredible place. And I used to be walking into the inwardly folding cairngorms and trying to capture my experience of that place. And I think what's allowed me to try and tackle the idea of romanticism is thinking more about less about the view and more about the embodied experience of landscape. And I've become much more interested in kind of embodied knowledge over academic knowledge, and how can, one handful of earth and kind of noticing a colour in the landscape kind of unlock a whole range of ideas.
I wonder how that, because as I say, you studied at Edinburgh College of Art, you grew up in Glasgow, and I always think that train journey, which is only about 50 minutes, that between the capital city of Scotland and also the largest city in Scotland, Glasgow, and you go through the the urban, but a number of towns kind of mining, and you see this landscape, you see the Firth of Forth, you see the bridges, and then sometimes it's seductively beautiful. Is that what kind of aroused a curiosity of how we tell those maybe hidden or untold stories?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'd always been intrigued. I've got memories as a child of seeing the Bings in West Lothian and thinking, what are those kind of weird big pink hills? I was really quite anxious as a child that they were these like landfills that had become so toxic they'd turn pink. I really didn't know what they were. And like speaking to friends that I've got who live in West Lothian and Mid Lothian, I think there's, some of them, a lot of people don't know what the Bings were.
So perhaps you could say, because they are this, so this is the area, again, west of Edinburgh, kind of the same area which Jupiter sits. So maybe, what are the Bings? And they're sometimes known as the Five Sisters as well. So
so there's one Bing near West Calder that's called the Five Sisters, and Bing's the Scottish word for kind of slag heap. They're basically these kind of monumental hills of waste rock from the paraffin mining industry that was the first paraffin mining industry in the world. It was huge in Scotland in the kind of 1800s. I mean, it's vast. I think there was, I can't remember the exact number, maybe 21 Bings. But, so much of the land was extracted from this area and kind of heaped and left.
And it's a shale, isn't it? I mean, if you go close to it, it's this kind of slippy, sliding kind of slithers of stone. And so there's kind of movement. But as you say, it's got this very pinky hue. And they are kind of literally a mountainous kind of hill range of shale. Which,
completely. And I think it's really interesting. You can tell what era of extraction the different Bings belong to based on their shape. So the earlier Bings were created kind of cart by cart. There was these workers called tipmen who would push the carts of a ton of shale over. And so there were kind of these bulbous, kind of lumpy forms. And then in the maybe 1920s, there was a development that coincided with the general strike of workers. So while the workers were striking because of the really terrible conditions in pay, the mining companies kind of advanced and created essentially tracks that they mechanised the process. And so the workers weren't needed anymore, other than a few, they call them blackleg workers, to operate the machinery. And all of a sudden, the newer Bings became kind of created by this very gentle slope. And so the Five Sisters looks more kind of traditionally like a mountain, but with these kind of 5 prongs. But I mean, they're strange because it was such an inefficient process when the shale was extracted and, heated to 700 degrees for the oil to be extracted from them. They were dumped. I mean, they weren't 700 degrees, but they were still, a couple hundred degrees hot. And so the rocks would fuse together. And so underneath these mountains, and you've got the kind of scree, the loose, really brittle shale on top, but in the centre it's just fused together rock. And that's then created a lot of issues. Speaking of water, there's flooding issues that have been caused because the centre is just this fused rock. And I mean, under one of the Bings as well, there's a house. The idea of looking at a colour of a landscape has just opened up so much interest and knowledge. The mining companies would basically buy up land and they would calculate the date of exhaustion of the land.
Exhausted by that, it was so depleted and degraded that of whatever they were gracious. So that was kind of built-in obsolescence idea that the land would become redundant.
Completely, and they would kind of map out which rivers, bridges, houses they would kind of swallow up with the shale. And I found that particularly uneasy concept when I was working towards a solo show in Glasgow that was called The Five Sisters, because I had a pain flare-up that meant I couldn't use my arms for 5 days, and I really felt like I'd reached my date of exhaustion. And it I just find it as such an uneasy but fascinating
so perhaps talk about these works which you showed first in Glasgow, I think it was last year, and now showing a couple at Jupiter, and maybe a little bit about, because you were these inspired by the Bings and the colour, but you tend to work on remnants of fabric, found fabric, which you pull together. Tell us a little bit of how that process works and what informs that process, and when you first started working with remnants of fabric.
I think maybe it was in 2015, 2016, I was friends with someone in the costume design department at ECA and noticed that they had this filled with interesting looking materials. And so I asked if I could ransack the bin. And I was interested in material being a kind of tangible form of colour before the paint is put on. And so I started to sew together, maybe it was a kind of economy thing of I couldn't afford expensive, high quality canvas. But I think it was more about the material and about kind of thinking, how can I capture this really experiential engagement with the landscape in a way that feels really tactile. And so, I started to sew together the materials, and I've kind of not really looked back since 2016. The gathering of the materials has kind of become a bit more diverse. So when I was on a Visual Art Scotland residency to Newland down in Cornwall, I met a lot of people and asked them to take me on their favourite walks. And while walking, we'd kind of talk about the process, and people ended up gifting me materials. So I got a fisherman's smock cloth with the fisherman's name still written into it, or a section of curtains from Tate St Ives from a Nam Gabo exhibition. It's this gorgeous purpley grey, humongous curtain. And actually an artist I met in 2022, then in 2025, gave me a piece of fabric that she'd been holding on for me. And it's a small section of linen that was Barbara Hepworth's studio curtains.
Oh my.
And so I've actually just sewn that into a new piece that's in an exhibition in Cambridge that's opening next week.
So the pieces at Jupiter, so what you've done, you've got these remnants of fabric and then you stitch together, but you also use earth pigment that you've collected yourself to colour. So there's this kind of wonderful, obviously earthy ochres, yellows, and also through the kind of layering and stitching, there's a sort of relief to them as well. There's not flat. And again, this sort of idea of mapping. And I was thinking of impastoed paint. You just use pigment to colour the fabric, but it rises up and it is like a terrain. So maybe just a little bit about the work at Jupiter and how they were informed by the shale bings.
Well, on my first kind of encounter with the bing, I was walking around, and they're super steep, some of a particular side of the Five Sisters.
Very slippy, slidey, yes.
Yeah, I turned a corner and I basically slipped maybe 3 meters down, and I was covered in this kind of plume of dark grey smoke. My trousers were covered, and I thought, this is wild. It was this really kind of tactile experience. And so I gathered some of that dark earth, and it turns out so the shale is oily black when it was first extracted, and then over the decades it's kind of become oxidized, and that's why we see the reddy pink shale. And so this soft black that I'd slipped on was part of a new extraction process due to the flooding. It's like a flooding prevention process. So I started to gather some of the black earth from that, and I've never used black in my painting. I think maybe that's to do with the kind of academic, you should never use black paint, mix brown and blue, or black doesn't exist in nature sort of thing. But I've never been drawn to it. I felt it's always been quite an empty colour. But I became absolutely fascinated.
So this kind of chance or slip, this encounter, this physical encounter with this plume of blackness kind of made you think again.
Yeah, completely. And so one of the works, Pioneer Species at Jupiter Artland, the kind of main body of the painting is just made with this one black earth, kind of mixing it with different levels of mediums to get different tones. And then the centre of the piece has kind of got like an insert in it that's a detail of one of these wee plants. So I became really interested in the idea of pioneer species, which I didn't know about at all. And so they grow in really specific conditions. So on like rocks exposed by glacial retreat, or lava flow that's hardened, and also shale bings. And so they're the first species of mosses and lichens that start to break down the stone that is really hostile. They break it down into earth, and it starts to create this kind of self-seeded ecosystem. And actually Cal Flynn writes about it in a really beautiful way in Islands of Abandonment, about these self-seeded ecosystems basically giving hope in a landscape that feels just decimated. There are these growths that feel really hopeful because, the bings
They now are declared a kind of place of natural interest, aren't they? So again, this kind of the embrace of the ecology, the landscape has embraced, and now they're, instead of seeing an eyesore, they're seen as something to be celebrated. So it's interesting how that kind of stretch of time, even though time, as Tania was just saying, it kind of is about a moment, but those numerous hundreds of moments have brought it back into a sense of something to be delighted and respected.
Completely. I mean, one of the Bings, I think it was maybe 2008, there was an ecologist, Barbara Harvey, who did a survey of the Bings, and she found more than 350 plant species, and I think maybe like 8 nationally rare species of lichen on this one Bing. And that is more species of biodiversity than Ben Nevis.
Wow. Yeah.
And I just find that incredible, this kind of this post-industrial waste landscape becoming this incredible ecosystem. Thinking of the Bings and the forms and preserving them and linking back to the Jupiter show is really that John Latham was key in preserving the Bings and having them designated as these monumental process sculptures through his work with the Scottish Development Agency. Because, I think those Bings maybe would have all been floored if it hadn't been for John designating them. And so I think it's incredible to have his work in the Jupiter show.
Did he, because again, I totally agree, and I'm really glad you brought that in, because it was brilliant to see the work, within the vicinity. Was he advocating for there to be kept? Was he doing that?
Yeah, so through the Artist Placement Group, he was placed in the Scottish Development Agency department of the government, basically to deal with the problem of the Bings. The UK government gave Scotland, I think, 10 years to deal with the Bings because they were seen as an eyesore. And John Latham essentially said they're not an eyesore, they're basically the biggest land art in the UK. They're these monumental process sculptures. And I think he also proposed a couple of sculptures to go on top of 2 of the Bings, although that never came to fruition. And then 3 of the Bings he designated as the Nidri woman, and so the body, the head and the heart, and his ashes were scattered on the heart. Although sadly that's since been floored and used for motorway and gardens, which is a real shame. But if you grew up in Scotland and you played on a football pitch, the red ash football pitches were made of shale.
Oh, really?
I mean, I've got really great memories of, like you'd get red ash on your school jumper, or like the idea now of looking back and thinking that you had wee bits of shale kind of embedded in your grazed knee from falling over on the ash pitch is just quite funny to reflect on.
And then are you still doing that with slipping down the shale? So from here, you're still kind of getting embedded with kind of pigment and colour and shale. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and maybe hopefully there won't be any falls next week. But the Bings walk that I'm doing with Jupiter Artland, I'll be leading a walk up Green Dykes Bing, which I think will be really incredible to kind of lead people into the landscape. Because I think Alec Finlay did a day of access to the Bings years ago. Because access is a really interesting concept when it comes to these landscapes.
No, I think it's brilliant having your work and John, which is literally a stone's throw away of those Bings, and recognising the specific and unique location of Jupiter. All these landscapes are contested, but its history in it, of that landscape as a whole, of what came out of it. And always that sense of movement, that's always got me. Of every transport hub kind of gathers. And now kind of just want to go back to Tania, having talked about wateryness, and now we're talking about shale and land and the work you've done, Book of Earth, for Earth Matters. My first question was that you've got, and I've got sitting here with 3 of your books. Maybe let's start with how that came about, and actually maybe your encounter with John Clark of Eldin, who was a contemporary of James Hutton, who was studied with Hutton at the University of Edinburgh, was a doctor, but was also this brilliant artist, and accompanied Hutton on many of his travels, and drew these wonderful of Jedburgh, of Salisbury Crags, Glentilt. But in your book, the drawing book, you include Eldin's drawings. How did you first encounter, and that's quite a number of years ago, his work? And then a few years ago, we went to see it for real. So maybe just tell that tale.
Well, as a maker or a sculptor, I had the question, how do the landscapes make themselves? How are they made? And geology has a lot of the answers to that question. So I'm not talking so much about human intervention into landscape and unmaking or making of landscape, but where do landscapes how do they generate themselves? Or what's the process of falling into different shapes or some sort of entropy of those forms? And I see water as a sculptor in the landscape, carving out either glacial valleys or gorges or moving vast amounts of sediment around. And again, that's another kind of excitement reading Hutton's work, that he very much understood this relationship between water and land, or sea and land, and all the solid parts of the present land have been composed by the sea. The actions of water, which it does take a bit of unpacking that thought, but yeah, it is this sort of dynamic element as well as this kind of connecting element. It's also changing land, changing our landforms. So looking to geology to kind of answer that question in some way, how a landscape's made, took me back to the very early days of geology. So looking for kind of entry points to this knowledge and understanding, which, Hutton was the person to kind of break with orthodox thinking on how landscapes were formed or made, following biblical narratives, and actually kind of talking about the earth as this sort of heat engine that could erupt or explode, or that stone could be read as this kind of incredible narrative of time, and different kind of geological events formed layers and layers and layers of landscape formation, and developed a language to describe all of that. But it was also visual language because of these illustrations by Eldon, and drawing a landscape in cross-section. The sort of thing you see at a cliff or in a gorge or a canyon or in minings, where you get these sort of cuts in the landscape and you can see those layers exposed. But it takes a certain kind of visual language to be able to describe place and time combined. And it's not a romantic making a picture. It's not a kind of, let's make a picture of the landscape. This is kind of drawings of the landscape that are trying to understand it and tell the story of its making. And that's why I thought these were remarkable drawings. I've always loved these cross sections of landscape before I'd read anything by Hutton, because of how well they describe place and time, and millennia of time as well, which is quite a challenge if you think about trying to make a drawing of that.
Perhaps I'd just say to maybe listeners that we here in Scotland, we're in a year-long celebration of James Hutton, who was born 300 years ago this year in 1726 in Edinburgh. He was a geologist. He's now kind of known as the father of modern geology. He was also a farmer and farming in the borders of Scotland. And it was very much by those observational looking at soil and then being very near to the coast at Sicker Point. And ever a friend, Clark of Eldon, did these exquisite drawings. And this was kind of answering back to this, as Tania was saying, about biblical time, that the earth took billions of years to come into being, rather than just 6,000, which was a biblical thinking. And so, Tania, that sense of when we went to see Clark of Eldon's drawings, which were held by the Huntarian in Glasgow, and we do have them on show in Earth Matters, I think for you to clap eyes on these extraordinary drawings, we were all moved. But maybe tell about that encounter with these drawings in real time.
Well, there was something just so exciting about seeing a book of them, page after page. So I hadn't seen these drawings in sequence. I didn't know that there'd then be a drawing of the moon in there. So more of a kind of agricultural mapping of field patterns, it was just wonderful seeing this sequence, turning the pages on these drawings. And we understand things in pictures. A lot of it, it's a really useful way to get our brains to kind of absorb information. So, a whole dense book of theory can be expressed in a very elegant drawing that kind of shows stratas of land, one rock on top of another on top of another, and you think, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. It's that moment when a drawing becomes a proof is a really exciting moment, and it means, yeah, you can access knowledge in a different way, in a visual way, beyond words. I mean, the words inform the drawing, but yeah, things can make sense visually.
I totally agree. And I think it's that welcome, that you're welcomed in. And in the drawing of Salisbury Cracks, there is Hutton's dog, Missy. And I go walking with my dog, and you can still kind of sense that sense of awe and questioning that is kind of key to every human, of how, what, why. And so then for Earth Matters, which celebrates Hutton and his curiosity 300 years on from his birth, and particularly looks at soil, you thought, I'm going to make a book. And is this your first book? You've published books which are text. How did you think about a book that has a sense of a beginning and end, and you decided to work with maps? And how did all this confluence of ideas here come together?
Well, I love maps, and I like drawing onto maps. They're slightly less scary than a white page, white piece of paper. But I made a book of seas onto hydrological charts. So through one route or another, I was given a lot of these hydrological. So these are maps of water produced for sailing purposes or maritime purposes. And I made a set of drawings onto these maps that were sort of looking at our liquid self in one way or another. So when this invitation came up, it seemed logical to me to look at this sort of mirror, and could I do this with land? If I'd done it with water, could I do it with land? So I was supplied with a whole set of maps from the Hutton Institute that produce extensive soil surveys of Scotland, and these maps are really lurid colours, like they're crazy.
And this took you back, because you used to more kind of bluey greys, and I mean there's yellows, there's kind of pinky, there's kind of deep blues. I mean, they are quite extraordinary. Yeah. Yes,
quite a psychedelic palette. And also the sort of cells of colour, like the way, you know, the yellow sits next to the pink. It's not always obvious, because it's about kind of a change in the soil, which might not be apparent. I mean, I'm sure Siobhan would notice these changes, but lots of people wouldn't. So they're really wonderful maps, but it was a bit of a shock, like thinking, oh, I've got to deal with this colour now. I'm not a colourist. So it was about then just exploring in quite a kind of a very subjective response to thinking about time, to thinking about soil, to thinking about worms, because I see worms as a kind of geological force in their own right. Kind of they move a huge amount of soil, and, you know, at all times there are worms moving soil. So I wanted to include worms in there as well. And some of the words that have kind of lodged in my brain like a kind of fish hook from Hutton. So the idea of deep time is such a beautiful, weighty kind of pairing of words. And then I think a lot about deep future as well, like what's going to happen. So, you know, mirroring that, words like non-conformity or unconformity, or these are very kind of emotive.
But what I think, having spent time with Book of the Earth, and we should say it's big. I mean, it's a portfolio size. I mean, and actually you've made several videos, and I was watching those of you turning the pages, and it's a sound as well, because you've layered the paint and the sound of these pages, and they're large pages of these maps, and then the way you put angles of strata and bluey greys. I mean, you've added, as you say, these wonderful earthworms that, again, as the kind of engineers of soil, and then the occasional text and fluid to solid, and all the strata of the earth had the origin at the bottom of the sea. So do you say these words have come to you from Hutton and thinking about geology and creation, but also the moon is there as well. And again, I was surprised as you when we saw the lost drawings by Eldon for real, that he wasn't just looking down, he was looking up. But then, and some of the works, you can see the mapping coming through, and sometimes it's more obliterated, but it's almost like a devotional book. It's much bigger than that. But I was thinking this sense of of you turning the pages and the intensity of the work, and yes. So yeah, anything more that you kind of wish to say about that making of a physical object that is mapping, but has a beginning and end?
I mean, it's a very sort of subjective response to geology and how we become part of the earth. At our end, that's where we are. And that, I think the expression "bury me here" crops up quite a lot in the book as well, because as well as needing this earth and soil to grow things and feed us, but do think about Hutton as a farmer as well. It's also where we return to. So there's a sense of, there is that sense as an ending in the book, and that sense of time. Geological time puts all sorts of things into perspective. It makes our time here very short. I mean, it's not to say we don't do quite a lot of damage while we are here, but it's that sort of, it's interesting talking to geologists about climate change. When the Earth's climate has changed so many times, ice ages have come and gone. It's just a different perspective that helps you pull right out from the here and now, and set that here and now in a much bigger timeline. Not to kind of diminish the now at all, but it's just another way of seeing time. And I wanted to explore that in the book, and it did feel weighty. It did feel, I mean, it's partly the scale of the maps themselves. I love the idea of a sort of elephant portfolio, I think they're called.
Yes.
Really big book that's kind of difficult to turn the pages, that it's physical act, it's haptic, there is a sound to the pages turning. And as we become increasingly digitized in our experience, I virtually fetishize a haptic experience of a book. And I had that experience looking through the original album of these drawings. It was a kind of, felt a bit of a pilgrimage moment for me. I mean, it is this kind of Bible of our thinking and our understanding. These are huge insights that really moved our thinking on. And, I don't think that Darwin would have been able to conceptualize the theory of evolution without this different way of thinking about
Absolutely. I mean, that radical thinking of throwing kind of question marks and provocations, essentially. Just going back now to Siobhan, I mean, it's interesting, Tania, you just brought that word up, pilgrimage, because you did an exhibition down in Penzance, and that was very much about pilgrimage. And again, how in the fabric, and you talk about, in a way you could say you've got the Barbara Hepworth, the Garbo, this and what they're invested in. But that seems important to you about through walking through a landscape of how you're mapping with your body, and often have a walking companion. And then maybe just go on to the exhibition that's about to open in Cambridge.
I think it's funny how these things, kind of disparate objects, seem to connect. Because I walk a lot, and I walk with people a lot. And I'd received a travel bursary to go to Orkney. And that week at the Ness of Brodgar archaeological site, they'd discovered a pottery sherd that had the earliest evidence of Neolithic textile in Scotland. And it was the textile obviously is organic, so it's disappeared. But it was an imprint of the textile into clay. And they think, one of the theories is that maybe it was the potter's sleeve. It's the inside of a vase or a jug. And I love that idea that maybe if it was on the outside, they would have smoothed it over. But this incidental imprint becomes this incredible piece of history. And that, I was thinking about that a lot, and I then didn't come into the work until my family started going through some of my granny's things. She died the year before I was born, so I never met her. But we had a box of her stuff, and going through, I discovered these contact relics. So my family's Catholic, and there's these tiny sections of linen that have been touched by the body of a saint. And I just thought how incredible that, I don't know when she went on these kind of pilgrimages to these holy sites, but she held on to that. And then that's been in my house for 31 years. And so the idea of kind of holding and touch, and then all of a sudden that kind of made complete sense to me, that the Nessa broadcarved pottery shared with the imprint and the touch, then linked to this textile and linked to these materials that I'm constantly sewing together. And so, the show down in Cornwall at a gallery called Hweg. Hweg is the Cornish word for kind and gentle.
I was wondering, I was going to ask, yes, it's HWEG, and I thought this is a word, so it's a Cornish word.
Yes, which I just think is it was a really nurturing space to have. That was my first solo exhibition, and the curator that runs it, Joe Lyward, has also curated the show at the Hyon Gallery in Cambridge that opens next week. And so that kind of linking in, it's a 10-year anniversary show of the Hyon that references back to the first exhibition that was of Alan Boness's collection. And
it's going to include Williamina Barnes-Graham, who we recently did a podcast on as well. So I was...
Yes. Yeah. So the 10 years ago, it was called Generation Painting. I think it was 55 to 65. And so looking at artists working in that decade. And so the curator has included some of those same artworks in the same positions they were shown 10 years ago. But then he's brought in contemporary artists who, for the last 10 years, so 2016 to 2026, have been kind of engaging with the ideas of generations and kind of affinities and sympathies between artists, but also artists who have spent a lot of time in Cornwall. And so the work I've got in that is called Longshore Drift, from Rackwick Bay to Lobar. So Rackwick Bay on Hoy, just off Orkney, where I spent a bit of time camping. And then Lobar is a beach in Cornwall that Peter Lanyon has painted. But that beach has actually been created, kind of speaking back to geology, created by a longshore drift, which I really liked what you were saying, Tania, about the new terms that you kind of, these words that you gather while you're thinking and researching. So longshore drift, something about some sort of wave basically moved this whole bit of sand from the sea to create a beach. And so it's created a loch or a lake in Cornwall that is, just a couple 100 metres from the sea. So it's this really interesting landform. And so I'm between, in the exhibition, that painting is between, there's Peter Lanyon and then Williamina Barnes-Graham, and then on the other side of me is Alan Davey.
Wow, that's
incredible. And other artists in the show are there's Labena Hamid's work, and Veronica Ryan, and Ro Robertson, and I mean there's many great artists I would really recommend.
We'll put a link to the exhibition. And just rounding off our conversation, but Tania, again, I was looking at your earlier work and the sculptures that ravine, canyon, depression, root and basalt, so that sense of your work, of the physical form of a sculpture, and when they look kind of marooned like little kind of land masses within a gallery space, and then to kind of working on maps, so going from the 3D to the 2D. How is your kind of movement towards those two? And you talk a lot about sculpting and how rivers sculpt, and divers. I always think I remember seeing that work. I mean, again, that's a few years back at Berwick upon Tweed, where you have these figures, and you don't often have figures in your work, but these kind of sculptured figures that look like if they were diving deep into the earth or to the sea or the kind of land beneath them. So just a little bit on how you manoeuvre between the physical and the 2D, 3D.
Maps are a great kind of scale drawing of landscapes, and again, they're not pictures. I struggle with pictures of landscape because to me, a landscape's an unbounded experience, doesn't have an edge. When you're in it, when it's all around you and you're part of it, nothing's framed. So sometimes I struggle with the sort of pictorial and representation. And I mean, I know landscape's a really loaded word as well. I mean, it's, I don't know whether I'm talking about kind of non-human or beyond human or nature. These are all like massively loaded terms, but the language we're sort of stuck with. And I really like the way maps kind of can contain huge areas of space, you know, the idea of scale. And as a sculptor, obviously, you always think about scale, but, you know, maps have a whole language of scale. So you can get a whole country on one bit of paper. Mapping's changed so massively with the digital form of the map. You know, we all hold a map in our phone that puts us at the centre all times. We're never lost anymore. It's, you know, that's what maps were for. They were for orientation and navigation. And now we're never lost. So yeah, we're a little dot at the middle of everything. And that's a massive change in our understanding of the map. And I think artists are making maps in so many forms, so many visual forms. I mean, not standard maps, but we're mapping our experience and, you know, however that manifests. I love moving between the 2D and the 3D, but I'm not even sure I draw drawings. I think I make drawings. And my drawings are often very kind of, yeah, they're made rather than drawn. I'm not necessarily trying to represent something or make a picture of something. It's more like trying to recreate a process in the drawing. And I think I relate to that in Siobhan's work as well. And that material value, you know, that's sort of my relationship with using water in my work. You know, I completely think of rivers as living things. You know, I think each river has a voice, each river has its own kind of spirit, and, you know, they're living entities, and you can express that in terms of their ecology or character or history, or all the kind of the way they embody a place. I mean, literally in their sediments, you know, they contain a little bit of all the land around them. But it's also that sense how they've flowed through the time of that place. You know, they have been passing through with whatever else has been going on. So they have a huge amount of spirit to them, and they are alive. And I love the way Siobhan talks about landscape as so sort of characterful and so specific, and that, you know, which combines a knowledge of how something was made, and then the ecology that's making itself now in that landscape. You know, you're talking about, you know, this sort of very real kind of entities and place.
Thank you. Now, but if there's anything you wish you wanted to say or ask each other, even.
I mean, when I was at the Hugo Burge Foundation recently for the residency, I really was feeling that kind of cutting and sculpting of the landscape with the rivers there. There's just this incredible winding that's then kind of banked by the red earth. So yeah, I felt that. And it's just, I mean, just to you, it's been great to talk, because I when I first started at Edinburgh College of Art, I went to your show at the Fruitmarket in 2014. So it was really nice to then this, you know, over 10 years later, to be chatting about the work. Because I mean, the earth pigments I find are so linked to water, although I'm not using the water from the rivers in the work necessarily, although all pigment is mixed with water. You know, pigments in riverbeds are like along the coastal path in Cornwall, or, you know, mining waste that's created ochre deposits in a river in Leven up in Fife. It's, you know, it's all really interconnected. So it's been really great to talk to you more about your work.
And my question or comment, I was wondering about, going back to Jupiter, whether Charles Jenks and his sculpted kind of cleaving, and I always think it's like if you had a kind of knife, whether he was responding to the bings. He must have been aware of that. Do you think?
He must have been. I mean, I kind of feel like even if you don't know what they are or haven't consciously noticed them, just subconsciously travelling through the landscape, you must kind of soak up the forms, I think.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tania and Siobhan, for sharing so generously how you make and think about your work. And we'll give details about the exhibitions coming up. Huge thanks to you both. Many thanks for listening to our conversation. Extraction at Jupiter Artland is on until the 26th of July, and Earth Matters is at Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh to the 1st of November. Please look in the podcast description for links to these exhibitions and to Siobhan's upcoming exhibition at Downing College in Cambridge. And we've done numerous other podcasts. You might like to tune into our recent episode on the work of Williamina Barnes-Graham, where we chat to Williamina Barnes-Graham Trust Director Rob Airy and filmmaker Mark Cousins. Also, Viv Lee and Jonathan Wade discuss working with earth, pottery and clay, who are also showing in Earth Matters at Royal Botanic Gardens. Big thanks as ever to Ryan Scott Media and Malin Lewis for the music. Many thanks for listening, and do hope you can join us again.